Time did what arguments never could. It clarified everything. After Igor left that day, Ludmila did not collapse the way she once would have. She expected grief to arrive like a storm, loud and destructive, but instead it came quietly, like a low tide pulling away what no longer belonged. The apartment felt larger again, not because anything had changed physically, but because nothing in it demanded her shrinking anymore. Weeks passed, then months. Igor tried to reappear in small, careful ways. A message that sounded reasonable. A phone call that pretended the past could be revised with enough patience. He spoke of therapy, of boundaries, of how hard it had been to live with his mother again. He never spoke about choice, never said I should have protected you. Ludmila noticed that absence immediately. It told her everything she needed to know. She listened once. Then she stopped responding. Signatures replaced shouting. Dates replaced promises. When it was over, Ludmila felt no triumph, no bitterness, only a deep, steady calm. She had grieved the marriage long before it officially ended. What remained now was space. Work flourished in ways she hadn't anticipated. With fewer emotional burdens draining her energy, her focus sharpened. She was offered a promotion she didn't chase and accepted it without guilt. For the first time, success didn't feel like compensation for suffering. It felt earned. She redecorated slowly, not to impress, not to erase memories, but to reflect who she had become. A new shelf replaced the one that had been emptied. Plants appeared by the windows. Light fabrics replaced heavy ones. The apartment no longer looked like a place someone endured life in. It looked lived in. Occasionally she thought of Iraida, not with anger, but with distance. When she heard through mutual acquaintances that the older woman continued drifting between relatives, repeating the same complaints, Ludmila felt a flicker of sadness that quickly passed. Some people never learn that control is not the same as care. That lesson was not hers to teach anymore. One evening in late autumn, Ludmila returned home as the city lights blinked on one by one. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and paused. Not because something was wrong, but because everything was right. The silence welcomed her. The warmth stayed. Nothing in this space demanded explanation or obedience. She cooked what she wanted, ate when she was hungry, watched what she liked, fell asleep diagonally across the bed, unafraid of taking up room. That night, she understood something fully and without doubt. She had not lost a family. She had escaped a system that required her silence to function, and in choosing herself, she hadn't become selfish, cold, or alone. She had become free, the kind of free that doesn't shout, the kind that breathes. With the approach of late summer, Ludmila noticed how her perception of time had shifted. Days no longer blurred together in a cycle of obligation and fatigue. Each morning felt distinct, shaped by choice rather than necessity. She woke up without the weight of someone else's expectations pressing down on her chest. Even mundane routines, making coffee, choosing clothes, deciding when to leave the house, carried a quiet sense of autonomy that still felt new enough to surprise her. She stopped rushing. That alone changed everything. She no longer ate standing up, no longer swallowed meals without tasting them. She learned the luxury of sitting still, of allowing moments to stretch without guilt. When she cleaned the apartment, she did it for herself, arranging things according to her own logic, her own comfort. No one rearranged her shelves afterward. No one sighed disapprovingly behind her back. The space finally reflected the person living in it. Occasionally, she caught herself smiling for no particular reason. These smiles startled her. They felt unearned, spontaneous, as if her body remembered joy before her mind had fully accepted it as permissible. She let them happen anyway. One afternoon, while sorting through old photographs, she came across images from the early days of her marriage. In those pictures, she recognized a version of herself she had almost forgotten, hopeful, attentive, slightly unsure, but genuinely open. She studied that woman carefully, without judgment. She did not feel anger toward her, only tenderness. That woman had done her best with what she knew at the time. She placed the photos back into their envelope, not as evidence of failure, but as proof of growth. The city outside her window, felt louder now. Not because it had changed. She heard children playing in the courtyard, neighbors arguing, laughter spilling from balconies late into the night. Life was messy, imperfect, alive, and for the first time in a long while, she felt part of it rather than trapped inside it. There were moments when anger resurfaced unexpectedly, sharp and bright. It came not as rage, but as clarity. Anger at how easily her boundaries had been dismissed. Anger at how often her silence had been mistaken for consent. She learned not to suppress it. Anger, she realized, was not the enemy, it was a signal, one she now knew how to read. She began practicing saying no in small, inconsequential situations, declining extra work without explanation, ending conversations that drained her, choosing rest over productivity. Each no strengthened something inside her, like a muscle long unused. At night she dreamed differently. Gone were the recurring nightmares of crowded rooms and locked doors. Instead, her dreams opened outward. Long roads, open fields, unfamiliar cities waiting to be explored. She woke from these dreams feeling curious rather than afraid. Once, while standing in line at a grocery store, she overheard two women talking about family obligations, about how difficult it was to keep everyone satisfied. Their words echoed a past version of her own thoughts. She felt a brief pang of recognition, followed by relief. That life no longer belonged to her. She did not yet know what part two of her life would look like. She did not force a narrative. There was no urgent need to replace what had ended. For now, it was enough to exist without tension, without apology, without fear of being overruled in her own home. She understood something fundamental now. Peace was not passive. It was active, intentional, and sometimes lonely, but it was real. And as the season edged closer to autumn, Ludmila stood at the threshold of something unfamiliar but promising. She was no longer surviving. She was preparing. As the days accumulated, Ludmila slowly began to understand how deeply silence could heal. Not the heavy, suffocating silence she had endured when words were weapons and every conversation felt like a test, but a gentle, spacious quiet that allowed thoughts to arrive and leave without resistance. In the evenings, she often sat by the open window, listening to the distant hum of the city. Cars passed, voices echoed faintly from the courtyard below, a dog barked somewhere far away. These sounds no longer irritated her. They anchored her in reality, reminding her that life was moving forward, whether she clung to the past or not. She stopped checking her phone compulsively. At first, the habit lingered, an unconscious expectation of messages that never came. Over time, the screen lost its power. She could leave the phone in another room without anxiety. This, too, was freedom. Her body changed before her mind fully caught up. Headaches became less frequent. She slept without waking from imagined footsteps or raised voices. Even her breathing felt different, deeper, slower, more intentional. It surprised her how much of her energy had been consumed by simply enduring. One evening, while organizing old documents, she found the mortgage papers. The familiar numbers no longer filled her with dread. Instead, they represented something solid, proof of her resilience, of years of quiet responsibility that had gone unnoticed and unappreciated. She traced her name on the page with her finger, feeling a surge of pride she had never allowed herself before. Memories surfaced unpredictably. Not all of them were painful. Some were warm, gentle reminders of who she had been before life narrowed her world. A childhood summer spent at her grandmother's dacha, the smell of freshly washed laundry drying in the sun, laughter shared with friends, before obligations and expectations complicated everything. These memories did not hurt. They felt like invitations. She began reaching out, slowly, carefully. A coffee with a former colleague. A short phone call with an old friend she had lost touch with during the marriage. The conversations were awkward at first, as if she had forgotten how to occupy space without apologizing. But people responded warmly. They remembered her kindness, her intelligence, her quiet humor. No one saw her as broken. That realization unsettled her in the best possible way. There were moments when guilt crept in, uninvited and persistent. Guilt for choosing herself. Guilt for not enduring a little longer. Guilt planted by years of conditioning. She learned to observe it without obeying it. Guilt, she discovered, was often just fear disguised as morality. She started writing again, not letters this time, but fragments of thought, observations, sentences that came to her while walking or lying awake before sleep. She did not aim to create anything polished. The act itself mattered more than the result. Words became a way to reclaim her inner voice, one sentence at a time. On particularly difficult days, she reminded herself of one undeniable truth. Nothing had changed until she changed it. That clarity grounded her. It stripped away romanticized regret and replaced it with realism. She had not destroyed a family. She had saved herself. As summer approached, Ludmila felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath the calm. Anticipation. Not fear of what might go wrong, but curiosity about what might go right. She did not rush to define it. She allowed it to exist quietly, like a promise whispered rather than shouted. She knew now that part one of her life, the part defined by endurance, silence, and compromise, was coming to a close. Not with drama, not with bitterness, but with understanding. Understanding that survival was not the same as living. Understanding that love without respect was not love at all. Understanding that peace was not something granted by others, but something she had to protect fiercely. And most importantly, she understood that this ending was not empty. It was spacious. It was deliberate. It was hers. As the season shifted fully into spring, Ludmila found herself confronting a quieter, subtler challenge, learning how to live without constant vigilance. For months, perhaps years, her nervous system had been trained to anticipate intrusion, criticism, and sudden emotional shifts. Even now, in the safety of her own apartment, her body sometimes reacted before her mind could reassure it. A loud voice in the stairwell made her flinch. An unexpected knock tightened her chest. These reactions embarrassed her at first, until she learned to treat them with patience rather than judgment. She began walking more, choosing long routes through neighborhoods she had never explored before. Movement helped her process what words could not. With each step, she felt herself reconnecting to the physical world, grounding her thoughts in the present moment. She noticed details she had once overlooked. The uneven texture of sidewalks, the way sunlight filtered through budding branches, the murmur of conversations drifting from open windows. The city felt alive in a way it never had when her world was narrowed by tension. During one of these walks, she realized she was no longer rehearsing conversations in her head. There were no arguments to anticipate, no defenses to prepare. Her mind felt spacious. This mental freedom, she understood, was the true reward of leaving. Not independence alone, but peace. Her therapist suggested an exercise, writing a letter she would never send, to Iraida, to Igor, and to herself. Ludmila resisted at first. The idea felt indulgent, even unnecessary. But one quiet evening, she sat at her table and began to write. The words came slowly at first, then with surprising force. She wrote without censorship, without concern for politeness or consequence. She wrote about anger she had buried, about grief she had minimized, about fear she had normalized. When she finished, her hands trembled. She did not reread the letters. She folded them carefully and placed them in a drawer. The act itself was enough. That night, she slept deeply. Work continued to challenge her in new ways. Leadership required visibility, and visibility required confidence. Ludmila rose to the occasion gradually, learning how to assert herself without aggression. She discovered that authority did not require harshness. It required clarity. Colleagues responded positively. Trust grew. For the first time, she felt aligned, her external role reflecting her internal evolution. Not all responses were supportive. A distant relative contacted her unexpectedly, repeating Iraida's narrative almost word for word. Ludmila listened calmly, then ended the call politely. She did not argue. She did not explain. The need to be understood by everyone had faded. This, too, felt like progress. There were evenings when loneliness surfaced unexpectedly, sharp and sudden. She missed shared laughter. She missed being known by another person. On those nights she reminded herself that companionship gained at the cost of self-respect was not intimacy, it was erasure. The reminder did not eliminate the ache, but it kept it honest. One Saturday morning, Ludmila opened her closet and realized she owned clothes she had never worn, pieces she had bought impulsively, then avoided because they felt too much, too bright, too confident, too visible. On a whim, she chose one and wore it outside. No one stared, no one judged. The world did not collapse. She laughed aloud, startled by her own courage. Spring turned warmer. Windows stayed open longer. The air carried possibility. Ludmila began making plans that extended beyond necessity. A weekend trip. A class she had always wanted to take. Small, deliberate steps toward pleasure rather than survival. She understood now that recovery was not about returning to who she had been before. That version of herself no longer existed. Recovery meant becoming someone new. Someone shaped by experience, but not defined by it. By the time early spring arrived, Ludmila noticed something she had not expected. She was no longer measuring her days by what she had escaped from, but by what she was slowly building. The shift was subtle, almost unremarkable, yet deeply profound. Her life was no longer defined in opposition to Arida's control or Igor's absence. It was beginning to exist on its own terms. She rearranged the apartment one weekend, moving furniture not because it was necessary, but because she felt like it. The act was strangely emotional. Each adjustment affirmed her autonomy in small, tactile ways. This chair went here because she liked the light there. That shelf stayed half empty because space itself had value. Nothing needed justification. Nothing required approval. At work, Ludmila accepted the promotion her manager had hinted at months earlier. With it came more responsibility, longer hours, and a quiet sense of pride. She handled the transition with confidence that surprised even her. In meetings, she spoke without rehearsing every sentence internally. When disagreements arose, she did not retreat. She listened, responded, and trusted her judgment. The woman who once endured silence as a survival tactic was learning how to occupy space unapologetically. Socially, her circle shifted. Some acquaintances drifted away, uncomfortable with the changes they sensed in her. Others drew closer. She formed friendships rooted in mutual respect rather than obligation. Conversations deepened. Laughter came more easily. She discovered that intimacy did not require self-erasure. There were moments, however, when the past reached out unexpectedly. A familiar song, a phrase overheard on the street, the scent of a dish she had once cooked under scrutiny. These triggers did not overwhelm her anymore, but they reminded her that healing was layered, not linear. She allowed the memories to surface, acknowledged them, and let them pass. Each time, they carried less weight. One afternoon, Ludmila ran into Igor again, this time by chance, in a crowded cafe. He looked different. Not worse, not better, just changed. They exchanged polite greetings, spoke briefly about practical matters, then fell into an awkward silence. Ludmila realized with quiet certainty that she no longer loved him. She did not hate him either. He had become part of her history, not her present. The realization felt neither tragic nor triumphant. It simply was. When they parted, Ludmila felt light. Closure, she learned, did not always come from long conversations or emotional apologies. Sometimes it arrived as indifference. As spring unfolded fully, Ludmila allowed herself to imagine a future without fear attached to it. Not a detailed plan, no rigid timelines or expectations, but a sense of openness. She entertained the idea of love again, cautiously, without urgency. She thought about learning new skills, changing routines, reshaping her life in ways that once would have seemed impossible. One evening, she returned home after a long day and stood in the doorway of her apartment, listening. The space greeted her with familiarity and peace. She smiled, not broadly, but sincerely. This place held no tension, no hidden battles, no need for vigilance. It held her. She understood now that strength was not loud. It did not announce itself. It revealed itself in consistency, in boundaries maintained even when no one was watching, in the refusal to betray oneself for comfort. She had learned this lesson the hard way, but she carried it with quiet dignity. With winter settling firmly over the city, Ludmila's life acquired a quieter, more introspective rhythm. Snow muffled the sounds outside, turning the streets into pale corridors of light and shadow. Inside her apartment, the silence felt different now, no longer vast or uncertain, but companionable. She learned how to be alone, without feeling abandoned. Evenings were no longer something to survive, they became something to inhabit. She developed small rituals that anchored her days. Morning coffee by the window, watching commuters hurry past. Soft music while cooking dinner, chosen solely to please herself. Reading before bed, lingering over pages without worrying about the light bothering anyone else. These rituals were modest, almost invisible from the outside, but to Ludmila they were revolutionary. Each one affirmed a truth she was still learning to accept. Her needs mattered. Therapy sessions deepened. Ludmila began speaking not just about Iraida or Igor, but about her childhood, about the lessons she had absorbed long before marriage. She spoke of how she had learned early on to be easy, to avoid conflict, to earn love through compliance. The therapist listened carefully, helping her trace the invisible thread connecting past and present. Understanding did not erase the pain, but it softened its edges. It gave context where there had once been confusion. One session ended with a question that lingered long after Ludmila left the office. What would your life look like if you trusted yourself completely? She thought about it for days. The question was both liberating and frightening. Trusting herself meant accepting responsibility not just for survival, but for happiness. It meant believing she deserved more than endurance. Around this time, Igor's attempts to contact her slowed. The messages became shorter, less frequent, stripped of urgency. Ludmila suspected he was adjusting, not necessarily to life without her, but to the reality that she would not return. The absence of constant communication felt like another small liberation. She no longer checked her phone reflexively. She no longer rehearsed responses she would never send. Iraida, however, did not fade as easily. Once, Ludmila encountered her unexpectedly at a grocery store. The meeting was brief but charged. Iraida looked at her with open hostility, making no effort to conceal her disdain. She muttered something under her breath, an insult or accusation. Ludmila could not be sure. Ludmila met her gaze calmly, nodded politely, and walked away. Her heart raced afterward, but she felt an unmistakable sense of victory. The power dynamic had shifted. Iraida no longer occupied space inside her mind. As the year drew to a close, Ludmila faced the first major holiday alone. The idea had once filled her with dread. Now, it felt like a quiet experiment. She decorated the apartment minimally. A few candles, a small branch in a vase, lights along the window. She cooked a simple meal and ate it slowly, savoring each bite. There was sadness, yes, but also pride. She had not collapsed. She had not compromised. She had stayed. That night, she wrote in a notebook, something she had not done in years. She did not write about pain or anger. She wrote about clarity, about boundaries she wished she had set sooner, about forgiveness she owed herself, about the difference between love that consumes and love that protects. The act of writing felt like stitching together parts of herself that had been scattered. In early January, Ludmila received official papers initiating the divorce process. The envelope sat unopened on her table for hours before she gathered the courage to read it. When she finally did, she felt no shock, no grief, only a sober acknowledgement that a chapter was formally closing. She signed where required, her hand steady. This was not an ending imposed upon her. It was one she accepted consciously. Life did not suddenly become easy. There were difficult days, moments of doubt, even flashes of guilt that surfaced without warning. But these emotions no longer controlled her. She met them with patience rather than panic. She had learned that emotions, like weather, passed if given space. One evening, as winter began to loosen its grip, Ludmila stood at her window, watching the first signs of thaw. Water dripped from rooftops. Snow receded into gray patches. The city exhaled, preparing for renewal. She felt a quiet resonance at that change. She was not who she had been when the story began. She was someone steadier, someone who had learned, slowly, painfully, to stand without permission. As the weeks unfolded, Ludmila began to notice how deeply the past had etched itself into her reflexes. Freedom did not erase habit overnight. Sometimes, while cooking, she caught herself rushing, as if someone were waiting to criticize the seasoning or the timing. Other times, she paused mid-thought, realizing she no longer had to justify her decisions to anyone. These moments startled her, not because they were painful, but because they revealed how thoroughly she had been conditioned to shrink herself. She started therapy quietly, without announcing it to anyone. The sessions were not dramatic. There were no sudden revelations or theatrical breakthroughs. Instead, there was steady excavation. Sentence by sentence, memory by memory, she unpacked what it meant to live for months under constant scrutiny. The therapist listened, occasionally asking questions that forced Ludmila to see patterns she had normalized. Control disguised as care. Endurance confused with strength. Naming these dynamics felt uncomfortable at first, but it gave structure to emotions that had previously felt chaotic. Outside the therapist's office, Ludmila rebuilt her life cautiously. She reconnected with friends she had distanced herself from, embarrassed by how much she had hidden. To her surprise, they did not judge her. They listened. They offered support without interrogation. Shared laughter returned slowly, tentative at first, then warmer. She realized how much she had missed being seen without being measured. Igor continued to appear at the edges of her life. Emails, missed calls, messages sent late at night. His tone shifted over time, cycling through regret, resentment, nostalgia, and anger. Sometimes he blamed his mother. Sometimes he blamed Ludmila. Rarely did he take responsibility for his inaction. Each unanswered message was not an act of cruelty, but an act of self-preservation. Iraida, meanwhile, escalated. She contacted mutual acquaintances, painting herself as a grieving mother abandoned by an ungrateful daughter-in-law. Rumors reached Ludmila through indirect channels. Once, at a family gathering she chose not to attend, Iraida reportedly declared that Ludmila would regret her decision, that independence was an illusion for women like her. When Ludmila heard this, she felt no urge to defend herself. The absence of reaction surprised her. Iraida's voice, once omnipresent, was fading. Autumn deepened. The city changed colors. Ludmila walked more, breathing in cold air that sharpened her senses. With each passing day, her body seemed to relearn ease. Her shoulders lowered. Her sleep deepened. She began waking without dread. These changes were subtle but cumulative, like healing beneath the surface of the skin. One evening, while sorting documents, Ludmila found old photographs from the early years of her marriage. She studied her younger self, smiling beside Igor, eyes bright with expectation. The sight did not break her. Instead, it filled her with compassion. That woman had loved sincerely. She had believed in partnership. She had not failed. She had simply been unprotected. This realization marked a quiet emotional shift. Ludmila stopped framing her past as a series of mistakes. She began to see it as a sequence of choices made with the information and emotional tools she had at the time. Growth did not require self-punishment. It required honesty. As winter approached, Ludmila finalized practical matters, legal consultations, financial separation, administrative tasks that once would have overwhelmed her, now felt manageable. She approached them methodically, without drama. Each signature was a boundary drawn clearly, firmly, without apology. There were moments of loneliness, of course, evenings when the apartment felt too quiet, holidays that passed without shared rituals, but loneliness no longer frightened her. It felt cleaner than captivity. It left room for thought, for rest, for the possibility of something new, whatever that might be. One night, as snow began to fall outside her window, Ludmila made tea and sat wrapped in a blanket, watching the streetlights blur beneath drifting flakes. She felt neither triumph nor sorrow. She felt steady, rooted. The chaos that had once defined her days was now distant, contained within memory, rather than reality. She understood then that leaving had not solved everything. It had not erased pain or guaranteed happiness. What it had done was restore her agency, and that restoration, fragile but real, was enough. The days immediately following Ludmila's departure passed in a strange, weightless haze. Time no longer pressed against her chest the way it once had. Instead, it drifted, slow and quiet, giving her space to notice things she had forgotten existed. The way morning light crept across the bare floor, the absence of footsteps behind her, the fact that silence no longer felt like a prelude to criticism. Even the smallest details, boiling water, folding clothes, opening a window, felt different when no one stood ready to judge how she did them. At first, she moved through her new apartment cautiously, almost apologetically, as if expecting someone to burst in and reclaim the space. She caught herself walking softly, lowering her voice when speaking on the phone, arranging objects with unnecessary precision. Old habits clung stubbornly to her body, even when her mind understood she was safe. It took time for her shoulders to relax, for her breathing to deepen, for her movements to lose their tension. Healing, she realized, was not a single moment of liberation. It was a process of unlearning fear. Igor called that same evening. Ludmila watched the phone vibrate on the floor beside her mattress. She did not answer. The calls continued over the next several days, alternating with messages filled with confusion, anger, pleading, and self-pity. He accused her of abandoning him. He begged her to come back. He promised to talk to his mother, to set boundaries, to change everything. Ludmila read each message once, then placed the phone face down. None of the words addressed the core truth she had already accepted. Promises made after damage were not the same as protection offered when it was needed. She accused Ludmila of destroying the family, of betraying tradition, of being heartless and ungrateful. She warned her that no one would respect a woman who left her husband. Ludmila deleted the messages without responding. She had spent months absorbing Irida's voice. She refused to let it follow her into this new chapter. Returning to work became easier. Colleagues noticed the change before Ludmila did. She smiled more. She spoke more confidently. She no longer lingered anxiously after hours, afraid of going home. During lunch breaks, she took walks, ate slowly, allowed herself to exist without urgency. One afternoon, her manager complimented her focus and hinted at a possible promotion. The acknowledgement startled her. She had forgotten that growth was possible when energy was no longer wasted on survival. Yet beneath the calm, grief lingered. At night, memories surfaced uninvited. Not only the pain, but the good moments too. The shared jokes, the dreams they once spoke aloud. Ludmila mourned not just the marriage she had lost, but the version of herself who had believed love alone could compensate for a lack of boundaries. She cried quietly, without shame, allowing the sadness to pass through her rather than swallow her whole. Weeks later, Igor showed up unannounced at her door. Ludmila froze when she heard the knock. For a moment, old instincts urged her to hide, to retreat, to brace herself. Instead, she opened the door. Igor looked thinner, older. His confidence had eroded, replaced by desperation. He spoke quickly, repeating familiar phrases, insisting he could fix things. Ludmila listened calmly. When he finished, she told him gently but firmly that she was not returning, that she needed space, that the marriage as it existed had ended long before she left the apartment. Igor reacted poorly. He accused her of being cruel, of giving up too easily. She understood now that his anger was rooted in loss of control, not love. She asked him to leave. When the door closed behind him, her hands shook, but only briefly. The fear passed. What remained was relief. As summer gave way to early autumn, Ludmila's life settled into a new rhythm. She bought furniture slowly, choosing each piece deliberately. A small table by the window, a bookshelf for the volumes she had rescued, a lamp that cast warm light in the evenings. Each purchase was an act of self-definition. This space reflected her choices, not compromises forced upon her. One evening, while unpacking the last box, Ludmila found the damaged remains of her wedding dress, carefully folded. She held the fabric in her hands for a long time. It no longer represented loss. It represented survival. She placed it gently back in the box and stored it away, not as a wound, but as a reminder of what she had endured and outgrown. She did not yet know what the future held. Divorce papers loomed. Conversations remained unfinished. Healing was incomplete. But as she stood by the window, watching leaves scatter across the street below, Ludmila understood something fundamental. She had reclaimed authorship of her own life, and that, more than anything, marked the true beginning of her story. The decision Ludmila made that night did not announce itself with excitement or fear. It settled into her quietly, like a stone placed carefully at the bottom of a river. From the outside, nothing changed. She still woke early, went to work, returned home, prepared meals when necessary, and avoided unnecessary conversations. But inside, her thoughts had shifted direction. She was no longer asking, "How long can I endure this?" She was asking, "How do I leave without destroying myself in the process?" The next morning, Iraida complained about the noise Ludmila made while getting dressed. Ludmila apologized politely, though she knew the complaint was invented. She had learned that arguing over facts was pointless. Iraida needed dominance, not truth. Ludmila poured herself tea and drank it standing by the window, looking down at the street. People hurried along the sidewalk, absorbed in their own lives, unaware of the small private war unfolding several floors above them. The ordinariness of the scene grounded her. The world was larger than this apartment, larger than Iraida's voice, larger than Igor's silence. At work, Ludmila began to move with purpose. During her lunch break, she researched rental listings discreetly, bookmarking options that fit her budget. She avoided anything extravagant, focusing instead on safety, proximity to public transport, and privacy. The studio apartment would be enough, a place where no one rearranged her belongings or commented on her tone of voice. The simplicity of the goal felt liberating. She contacted a colleague she trusted, asking casually if she knew of any available places. The act of asking itself felt like rebellion. Meanwhile, Iraida's behavior intensified. Perhaps she sensed the shift, the quiet withdrawal of emotional energy. She began staging small crises, sudden aches, exaggerated sighs, dramatic complaints about feeling unappreciated. She reminded Igor frequently of her sacrifices, recounting hardships from decades ago with meticulous detail. Igor responded as expected, hovering anxiously, offering reassurance, promising devotion. Ludmila observed these exchanges from a distance, feeling as though she were watching a familiar play performed one final time. One evening, Iraida confronted Ludmila directly. She accused her of being cold, ungrateful, and distant. She demanded to know what was wrong. Ludmila listened without interruption, her face composed. When Iraida finished, clearly expecting an emotional response, Ludmila simply said she was tired. The answer deflated Iraida momentarily, though it did not satisfy her. She retreated to her room, muttering about modern women and broken values. Igor tried to talk to Ludmila later that night. He suggested they take a short vacation together, just the two of them, as if physical distance alone could resolve what had been allowed to fester. Ludmila listened patiently, then asked a simple question. What would happen to his mother while they were gone? Igor hesitated. He admitted she could not be left alone. The answer spoke louder than any argument. Ludmila nodded and ended the conversation. There was nothing more to discuss. Days turned into weeks. Ludmila secured a viewing for a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. She attended during her lunch break, heart pounding as she climbed the narrow staircase. The apartment was modest, but clean and bright. Sunlight filtered through a single window, illuminating an empty room that smelled faintly of fresh paint. Ludmila stood there silently, imagining her life unfolding within those walls. No commentary, no surveillance, no competition for space. She signed the paperwork 2 days later. She did not tell Igor immediately. She needed time to prepare, to gather her belongings discreetly, to organize her finances. Each item she packed felt symbolic. Clothes folded neatly into bags. Documents secured in a folder. Books rescued from storage. She worked slowly, deliberately, hiding nothing but revealing nothing either. Iraida noticed the subtle changes, but misinterpreted them as resignation rather than preparation. The night Ludmila finally spoke, there was no argument. She waited until Iraida was asleep. Igor sat at the table, scrolling through his phone absent-mindedly. Ludmila told him calmly that she was moving out. Not temporarily, not as a threat, permanently. The words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Igor laughed nervously at first, assuming she was exaggerating. When he realized she was serious, panic set in. He pleaded, promised change, insisted they could fix things. Ludmila listened, unmoved. She explained that change required action, and action had not come when it mattered. When Iraida learned of the decision the next morning, the reaction was explosive. Ludmila was selfish, cruel, manipulative. She was abandoning her husband. She was destroying the family. Ludmila said nothing. She finished packing, lifted her bag, and walked out without looking back. The sound of the door closing behind her echoed louder than any insult. The first night alone in her new apartment was quiet in a way that felt almost unreal. Ludmila sat on the floor, surrounded by boxes, listening to the hum of the city beyond the window. The silence was not empty, it was full of possibility. She slept on a mattress borrowed from a friend, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like detergent and freedom. For the first time in months, her dreams were her own. This departure did not mark the end of pain, it marked the beginning of recovery. The path ahead would be uncertain, complicated by legal decisions, emotional fallout, and the slow dismantling of a marriage that had failed her. But as Ludmila lay there in the dim light of her new home, she felt something unfamiliar and precious, control over her own life. The days after that realization blurred into one another, stitched together by fatigue and a quiet, simmering resolve that Ludmila herself barely recognized at first. She stopped counting the days Iraida had spent in their apartment because the numbers had lost meaning. Time no longer moved toward an end. It simply accumulated, heavy and oppressive. Each morning Ludmila woke with the same dull ache behind her eyes and the same thought pressing against her mind. I cannot live like this. Yet the thought did not yet transform into action. It lingered, waiting for the right moment to crystallize. Iraida, sensing Ludmila's withdrawal, became more deliberate in her behavior. Her comments were no longer accidental or impulsive. They were calculated. She spoke loudly when criticizing Ludmila, ensuring Igor heard every word. She praised him excessively, reminding him of how much she had sacrificed for him, how difficult her life had been, how ungrateful the world was to mothers like her. Ludmila watched the dynamic unfold like a pattern repeating itself, predictable and exhausting. Iraida positioned herself as the victim, Igor as the protector, and Ludmila as the antagonist by default. One evening, Iraida announced she would be inviting guests over. She did not ask, she informed. Ludmila returned home to find unfamiliar women sitting around the kitchen table, sipping tea and laughing loudly. Iraida introduced Ludmila as if she were a distant acquaintance rather than a member of the household. Throughout the evening, Iraida shared stories that subtly undermined Ludmila, recounting exaggerated anecdotes about her supposed laziness and lack of domestic skills. The guests nodded sympathetically, offering advice Ludmila had not requested. Ludmila stood silently, her face expressionless, feeling exposed and humiliated within the walls of her own home. After the guests left, Ludmila confronted Igor. Her voice was calm, dangerously so. She explained that this was no longer acceptable, that boundaries had been crossed repeatedly, that she felt erased. Igor listened with visible discomfort, rubbing his temples, avoiding her eyes. He admitted that his mother could be difficult, but insisted that confrontation would only make things worse. He asked Ludmila to be patient, to understand that Iraida was lonely, vulnerable, and aging. Ludmila asked him quietly, where she fit into this equation. He had no answer. Silence stretched between them, thick and unresolved. That night, Ludmila slept poorly. The heat, the cramped space, and the weight of unspoken truths pressed down on her chest. Memories surfaced uninvited. The early days of her marriage, the laughter, the plans they had made together, the belief that partnership meant protection. She remembered the apartment when it still felt like home, before it had become a contested territory. These memories did not comfort her. They sharpened the pain, highlighting the distance between what had been promised and what now existed. In the weeks that followed, Ludmila began to change in subtle but significant ways. She stopped explaining herself. She stopped defending her choices. She stopped trying to win approval that would never be granted. Instead, she observed. She noted how Iraida reacted to resistance, how Igor retreated at the first sign of conflict, how power shifted effortlessly toward the person who demanded it most aggressively. This observation did not make her bitter. It made her clear-headed. One afternoon, Ludmila took a day off work without telling anyone. She wandered through the city alone, sitting on a park bench watching strangers pass by. The anonymity felt soothing. For the first time in months, she breathed deeply without feeling watched or judged. She imagined alternative versions of her life, scenarios she had never allowed herself to consider seriously. Living alone, starting over, reclaiming silence. The ideas frightened her, but they also sparked something dangerously close to hope. When she returned home that evening, Iraida noticed immediately that Ludmila was different. There was a calmness about her, a detachment that made confrontation less satisfying. Iraida attempted provocation, criticizing the way Ludmila placed her shoes by the door, accusing her of being careless and inconsiderate. Ludmila responded with a simple acknowledgement and walked away. The lack of reaction unsettled Iraida more than any argument ever had. This dynamic repeated itself over the next several days. Ludmila became emotionally unavailable. She answered questions briefly, avoided shared spaces when possible, and kept her personal belongings packed neatly, as if ready to leave at a moment's notice. Igor noticed the shift, but misinterpreted it as exhaustion. He reassured himself that things would eventually return to normal, ignoring the unmistakable signs of impending rupture. The breaking point approached quietly, without drama or raised voices. It arrived one evening when Ludmila overheard Iraida speaking on the phone to a relative. She listened from the hallway as Iraida described her son's marriage as a mistake, blaming Ludmila for every perceived flaw. Iraida laughed, stating confidently that young wives came and went, but mothers remained forever. The words landed with chilling clarity. Ludmila felt no anger, no tears, only certainty. Later that night, Ludmila sat at the small table by the window, writing numbers in a notebook. Income, expenses, savings. She calculated silently, methodically. The math was simple. She could leave. It would be difficult, it would be lonely, but it was possible. That realization marked a turning point far more significant than any argument could have been. As she closed the notebook, Ludmila looked around the apartment one last time, not with resentment, but with detachment. The space no longer represented safety or partnership. It was merely a place she happened to occupy, temporarily. For the first time since Iraida's arrival, Ludmila slept soundly that night, not because her circumstances had improved, but because she had finally made a decision, one she had not yet spoken aloud, but which had already begun to reshape everything. Ludmila did not immediately recognize the exact moment when endurance turned into quiet despair, because it happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, like a slow leak that drains something essential without making noise. Each day followed the same exhausting pattern. She woke before sunrise, careful not to disturb Iraida Makarovna, whose sleep, according to her own declarations, was light and easily broken. Ludmila prepared breakfast, tidied the kitchen, dressed quickly, and left for work with the strange sensation that she was a guest passing through her own life. The folding bed they slept on groaned every time she turned at night, but she said nothing. She told herself it was temporary. She repeated those words like a prayer, clinging to them as if they were a promise carved in stone, rather than a vague hope that no one seemed intent on honoring. Work became the only place where Ludmila felt momentary relief. Her office, with its neutral walls and predictable routines, offered a sense of order she desperately needed. There, her efforts were measured, acknowledged, and at least occasionally appreciated. Numbers made sense. Documents followed logic. Conversations, while sometimes tedious, did not undermine her worth as a human being. Yet even at work, she found her thoughts drifting back to the apartment, to the tension waiting behind the front door. By late afternoon, anxiety settled in her chest, tightening with each passing hour. She delayed returning home whenever she could, lingering over tasks, volunteering for extra assignments, anything to postpone the inevitable confrontation with a space that no longer belonged to her. When she did return in the evenings, exhaustion weighed heavily on her body, but rest was impossible. Iraida Makarovna greeted her not with warmth, but with commentary. There was always something wrong. The groceries Ludmila bought, the way she folded laundry, the tone she used when speaking to Igor. Even silence was criticized. If Ludmila said nothing, she was cold and distant. If she defended herself, she was rude and disrespectful. There was no correct response, no acceptable version of behavior that satisfied Iraida. Ludmila began to understand that the criticism had little to do with her actions and everything to do with control. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Ludmila stepped into the apartment and froze in the doorway. The smell of freshly cooked borscht filled the air. Iraida stood at the stove, moving with energy that contradicted every complaint of pain she had voiced earlier. Without turning around, she announced that she had tasted Ludmila's cooking from the previous day and found it unacceptable. Igor, she said, needed proper nutrition. He worked hard. Ludmila stood there, her bag slipping from her shoulder, and stared at the scene as if it belonged to someone else's life. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. The woman who claimed she could barely walk now moved confidently around the kitchen, reorganizing shelves, criticizing recipes, and asserting authority without hesitation. Weeks passed, and Iraida settled in completely. She treated the apartment as her own, rearranging furniture to suit her preferences and discarding items she deemed unnecessary. Cosmetics disappeared from the bathroom shelves. "Why do you need so many creams?" she asked dismissively. Advice flowed constantly, unsolicited and absolute. She instructed Ludmila on how to wash floors properly, how to fold clothes, how to speak to her husband. She criticized Ludmila's personality openly, accusing her of being too sharp, too independent, too modern. She spoke nostalgically about her own marriage, describing herself as gentle, obedient, and endlessly patient, holding herself up as the standard Ludmila was expected to meet. Igor listened to these speeches in silence. Sometimes he nodded. Sometimes he looked away. Rarely did he intervene, and when he did, it was half-hearted, phrased as a joke or a weak attempt to change the subject. Each time Ludmila glanced at him, hoping for support, she found his gaze fixed elsewhere. The absence of defense hurt more than the criticism itself. It confirmed a growing fear she struggled to articulate, that in moments of conflict, Igor would always choose the path of least resistance, even if that path led directly through her. By the end of May, it became clear that the agreed-upon 2 months were nothing more than an illusion. Iraida made no preparations to leave. She spoke of future plans as if her presence were permanent, commenting on how we would do things differently from now on. She walked to the store, met friends in the city, spent evenings watching television on the sofa she had claimed as her own. When Igor timidly suggested that perhaps it was time for her to return home, Iraida reacted with theatrical outrage. She accused him of cruelty, of abandoning her, of wanting her to die alone. The emotional manipulation was immediate and effective. Igor retreated, defeated before the argument truly began. Watching this exchange, Ludmila felt something cold settle inside her. It was the realization that Iraida was not leaving, not willingly, and not soon. The apartment had become a battleground where rules were dictated unilaterally, and Ludmila had been relegated to a subordinate role. Summer arrived with oppressive heat, amplifying every discomfort. The apartment, located on the top floor, turned into an oven. There was no air conditioning. Windows offered little relief. Ludmila woke each morning soaked in sweat, dragged herself through workdays, and returned home to the same stifling atmosphere. Meanwhile, Iraida seemed to flourish. Her complaints about her leg vanished entirely. She moved briskly, cleaned obsessively, rearranged belongings, and behaved as though she were the rightful owner of the space. The first serious confrontation came in mid-June. Ludmila returned home to find her wedding dress submerged in a basin of water. The sight struck her like a physical blow. That dress, delicate and irreplaceable, held memories she cherished quietly. Iraida dismissed her shock casually, explaining that the dress had been hanging unused and gathering dust. Ludmila's voice trembled as she tried to explain that the fabric was silk, that it required special care. Iraida waved her off, insisting she had washed it by hand. The fabric was stained, seams distorted, the dress ruined beyond repair. Tears streamed down Ludmila's face as she stood over the basin. Iraida watched with genuine confusion, unable or unwilling to understand why this mattered. When Igor arrived home, Iraida immediately appealed to him, portraying herself as well-intentioned and misunderstood. Igor examined the ruined dress briefly, then murmured that his mother had only wanted to help. That was the moment something inside Ludmila fractured completely. She locked herself in the bathroom and cried silently, pressing her hands over her mouth to stifle the sound. After that night, she stopped trying to be polite. She responded with short answers, avoided conversation, and withdrew emotionally. Iraida sensed the shift and grew angrier, her comments becoming sharper, more openly hostile. She spoke badly about Ludmila to friends over the phone, describing her as cold, incompetent, and unfit as a wife. Ludmila listened without reaction, no longer surprised. She no longer cried. She waited, though she did not yet know for what. Something inside her was preparing, gathering strength quietly, patiently, with the same discipline she had applied to every responsibility in her life. By July, the situation was unbearable. Books Ludmila had collected over years disappeared from the shelves, packed away to make room for Iraida's cookware. When Ludmila protested, Iraida dismissed the books as clutter. The argument that followed revealed a fundamental truth. Iraida believed the apartment belonged to her, by extension, because her son lived there. Ownership, effort, and boundaries meant nothing to her. That night, Ludmila tried once more to speak to Igor, to make him understand that his silence was destroying their marriage. He asked her to endure a little longer. How long was a little? A month? A year? 10 years? He had no answer. Lying on the folding bed that night, staring at the wall, Ludmila realized with painful clarity that she was alone, despite being married. And this realization marked the true end of the life she thought she had. It often happens that people expect visits from relatives to bring warmth, laughter, and a sense of family unity. But for Ludmila, that expectation shattered the moment the doorbell rang on a quiet spring morning. Until that day, her life, though modest and demanding, followed a rhythm she understood and controlled. She lived by schedules she set herself, endured responsibilities she had chosen, and shared her space with a man she believed stood beside her, not behind anyone else. The idea that a single visit could dismantle all of that would have seemed exaggerated, even dramatic, had she not lived through it herself. When Igor told her that his mother was coming, Ludmila prepared herself for mild discomfort, a few critical remarks, and the usual tension that came with short family stays. What she did not prepare for was the complete erosion of her autonomy, her marriage, and her sense of self within her own home. Ludmila had never been a woman who sought conflict. She learned early in life that patience was often the easiest path through difficult situations. At work, she listened to colleagues complain about the same grievances day after day without interruption. In public, she swallowed irritation when strangers crossed boundaries or spoke rudely. Even in her marriage, she learned to smile through disappointment when Igor forgot anniversaries or arrived late without explanation. She told herself these were small things, unworthy of arguments, unworthy of resentment. Patience, she believed, was strength. It was maturity. It was what kept relationships intact, and for a long time that belief seemed justified. Her life wasn't perfect, but it was stable. She worked hard, paid her bills, and came home each evening to the same small apartment that represented independence she had earned with years of effort. That apartment was more than just four walls to Ludmila. 28 square meters on the outskirts of the city might not have impressed anyone, but to her, it symbolized freedom. She had bought it before meeting Igor, signing the mortgage papers with trembling hands and a fierce sense of determination. Every month, half of her salary went straight to the bank, a routine she followed without complaint. It wasn't easy, but it was hers. The furniture inside wasn't expensive, the kitchen barely allowed two people to move comfortably, and the sofa doubled as a bed, but every corner reflected choices she had made for herself. When Igor entered her life, she welcomed him into that space willingly, believing they were building something together, even if the foundation had been laid by her alone. Their marriage was quiet and practical. There were no lavish vacations or extravagant purchases. Igor worked as an engineer at a factory, earning enough to cover daily expenses and payments on his car loan. Ludmila worked as a manager in an insurance company, where her days were long and mentally exhausting, but stable. Together they created a routine that functioned, if not beautifully, then reliably. They cooked simple meals, watched television in the evenings, and talked about ordinary things. There was affection, familiarity, and the comfort of shared silence. Ludmila believed this was what adult life looked like. Not passion or drama, but partnership. And she trusted that when challenges came, they would face them together. Igor's mother, Iraida Makarovna, existed on the periphery of that life. She lived in another city, several hundred kilometers away, and visited occasionally. Her appearances followed a predictable pattern: jars of homemade jam, heavy sighs, pointed comments about cleanliness, and constant concern over how her son managed to survive in such a tiny apartment. Ludmila endured these visits with politeness, reminding herself that they were temporary. Iraida always left after a few days, returning to her own three-room apartment where she lived alone since her husband's death. Ludmila never questioned why that spacious flat stood empty, while Iraida complained endlessly about her son's living conditions. She assumed it was simply the nature of mothers who struggled to let go. Everything shifted the evening Igor came home unusually quiet. His face was drawn, his movements slow, and Ludmila sensed immediately that something was wrong. When he finally spoke, it was with the heavy seriousness of someone delivering bad news. His mother needed surgery. The word alone sent a chill through Ludmila. Illness, hospitals, recovery. Her mind filled the gaps before Igor explained further. He spoke of age, of risk, of how fragile everything suddenly seemed. Ludmila felt genuine fear. Whatever tension existed between her and Iraida Makarovna, she never wished harm upon her. She listened carefully, asked questions, and prepared herself emotionally for whatever support might be needed. The truth, however, was far less dramatic than the initial announcement suggested. The operation was planned, common, and not life-threatening. Varicose veins, the doctors said. Recovery would take time, but there was no immediate danger. Relief washed over Ludmila, but it was short-lived. Soon after, Iraida called Igor herself. Her voice, weak and trembling, carried the weight of loneliness more than pain. She spoke of having no one to rely on, of being afraid to stay alone, of needing her son. She did not directly demand anything, but the implication was clear. She asked, gently but persistently, whether she could stay with them for a couple of months until she recovered. When Igor repeated the request, he did so with pleading eyes, emphasizing that his mother was alone, that she had no one else. She looked around their apartment, imagined the lack of space, the disruption of routine, and the tension that would inevitably follow. But she also saw Igor's conflict and felt the familiar pull of responsibility. Saying no felt cruel. So she agreed, setting a boundary she hoped would protect them all. 2 months, no longer. At that moment, she still believed in reason, in fairness, in the idea that temporary arrangements remained temporary. Iraida Makarovna arrived in April, not like a guest, but like someone relocating. 3 large suitcases, several bags, and a box filled with cookware crowded the narrow hallway. She announced cheerfully that she had brought her own pots, criticizing the existing ones before even removing her coat. From the first hour, her presence filled the apartment completely, leaving no space untouched. Ludmila watched silently as Iraida surveyed the rooms with disapproval, commenting on everything from furniture placement to the seriousness of the household. The operation took place shortly after, went smoothly, and within days Iraida was discharged. But home, as she referred to it, was no longer her own apartment. It was Ludmila's. Within a week, Iraida had claimed the sofa, declaring that she needed rest and that it would be better for the young couple to sleep on a folding bed. Igor agreed without protest, whispering apologies to Ludmila late at night as they lay on the uncomfortable frame. "It's temporary," he said again and again. "She's in pain." Ludmila nodded, convincing herself that discomfort was a small price to pay for family peace. She woke at dawn, prepared breakfast, went to work, and returned exhausted each evening, only to find Iraida cooking in the kitchen, despite insisting she could barely walk. Criticism followed every action. Meals were inedible, housekeeping inadequate, behavior improper, and still, Ludmila said nothing. By the end of the first month, the apartment no longer felt like her home. Furniture was rearranged without permission. Personal belongings disappeared. Iraida openly commented on Ludmila's appearance, her manner of speaking, her tone with Igor. She compared her constantly to herself, recounting stories of how obedient and gentle she had been as a wife. Igor listened, nodded, avoided eye contact, and said nothing. Ludmila felt something tightening inside her, a quiet accumulation of frustration and disbelief. She began to understand that patience, once a strength, was slowly turning into self-erasure.